If you have lived in the city of Bangalore, India between the 1950s and the early part of the 2000s, the name Professor David K. Sebastian would be a familiar one in the church music circles. My piano, organ teacher, and mentor, I simply knew him as the finest organist I have ever seen perform live in India. In an age without social media platforms, watching Professor Sebastian play the grand organ at St. Mark's Cathedral, Bangalore, was our only musical treat. Today, we are going to relive the life and times of Professor Sebastian through none other than his son, Reverend Dr. Professor Jayakiran Sebastian, Dean and H. George Anderson Professor of Mission and Cultures at the United Lutheran Seminary, Philadelphia. Reverend Sebastian, welcome to the Fine Feathers podcast and thank you for willing to be our guest today. We are here to talk about Professor David K. Sebastian, and there is no better person to biographize Professor Sebastian other than you. Would you be kind enough to introduce us to his early life and times, sir?
First of all, let me say how delighted I am to be on this podcast, Rohit, for several reasons. One of the main things is the affection with which you hold my father, now almost 20 years since his death. You were there at his funeral service, you played at his funeral service, and it's gratifying to me that 20 years on, he's remembered with such fondness. So I'm really pleased to be part of this podcast and really appreciate you taking the initiative and inviting me to this. My father's full name is David Kadaban Sebastian, and each name has a history. And in order to understand who he is, we have to start with his name. And I'll begin with a middle name because very few people actually knew what the K in his David K. Sebastian stood for. And it's actually the name of a small village, small town in Karnataka, not very far from Bangalore, called Kadaba. My father's early life was one of tragedy and pain. He was born in this village as the first male child in a family which, up to that point, had had girl children. And for whatever reason, the birth of a male baby upset the family dynamics, and his father was actually killed, murdered by his own brothers. They must have been some kind of landholders in that area. And somehow the birth of my father upset some kind of inheritance equations. So, what we know is that my grandmother took the little boy and literally fled through the forest in the night. She actually saw the fire that was consuming the body of her husband, and she fled for her life to the one place where she knew she would get refuge. And that was to another little town called Puttur, where there was a Basel mission station led by a missionary. She must have gone all through the night. These are all family reminiscences. My father was not very keen to recreate some of these painful incidents from his past, but we do know that they landed up in Puttur and were given refuge by the Basel Mission missionary. The Basel Mission by that point had been in India for quite some time. They had started in Mangalore, Puttur at that time. It's now about 1.5 hours away by car, but at that time it was 10 hours away by bullock cart. So this missionary had a church already, a small mission compound, a boarding school, a school for children of that area. And my grandmother and my father were taken in, and in good time, they were both baptized. I have actually seen the church where they were baptized, but it doesn't exist anymore. It's been taken over by the government and demolished, and it's part of a school right now. But I have seen the baptism certificate. So here's where we come to his first name, David or David. So he was actually given one name, David, and they just wanted to identify him and they called him David from Kadaba, and that's how the David Kadaban comes. It was not a very pleasant time. They didn't have anything. My grandmother literally fled with nothing and worked then in the Puttur boarding home, and then they went to other places. But the point is that they found refuge there, and my father and grandmother found themselves within the church, which proved to be in multiple ways a mother in the broadest sense. So my father was put in the boarding home as a semi orphan, and there was something in him that already indicated to people in the mission station that he was an intelligent little boy who had all kinds of skills. One of the skills was obviously listening to the music in the church, looking at the Basel Mission hymn book with four-part harmony, mainly from old German chorales and hymns, which had been translated into Kannada and Tulu. But in good time, as he went through boarding and was reaching SSLC grade standard 10, missionaries had come and missionaries had gone. But in 1945 46, a young couple came from Switzerland as missionaries, just a couple of years before India got independence. This was Anna Marie Rossel and her husband, Reverend Jacques Rossel. And apparently, my father, having been in Puttur, then in Mulki, and then in Mangalore, it turned out that they had been told this boy has something special. If you could help him, that would be great. So this couple actually took special interest in him. My father even became for some time the person with whom they would practice their Kannada. And he also became the boy who, whether he liked it or not, listened to a lot of music because this couple brought with them old 78 records and a wind up gramophone. And my father was the boy who wound the gramophone for these missionaries. So they were hoping that he would become a pastor. And even though he wanted to study science, they insisted he do his BA in economics. They supported him for his studies at St. Aloysius College in Mangalore. And it was around this time that he decided that he was not going to be known as David from Kadaba. So the story goes that he took the score of St. Matthew's Passion, which had a picture of Johann Sebastian Bach in the front, and pointed to the name Sebastian and said, "This is the name by which I want to be known." And that's how we are one of the very few families in that circle who have the name Sebastian. So my father then, after his BA, certainly didn't want to go and study at the seminary. So two things happened. One, he was sent to do his MA in English at Wilson College, Bombay, but he was displaying more and more talent in four-part harmony, playing the harmonium, and this missionary couple decided that it would be good if he went to Switzerland, to Basel, to study at the Conservatory of Music in Basel. So the amazing thing about my father is that, having never seen a piano till he was in his late teens or early 20s, he was then admitted to the Academy of Music in Basel, studied the organ, and within 2 years or so had given a recital on the organ at the great Cathedral of Basel. So, this is the extraordinary thing about my father, that from a beginning of adversity, through his perseverance, through his intelligence, through his determination, through his ability to face difficult circumstances, and through the support of the Russells, was able to do the two things which became part of who he was: a trained English teacher and later professor, and a trained organist. So, after this period, Bishop Cotton Boys' School in Bangalore was looking for someone who could teach English and perhaps also have another skill, which my father certainly had in terms of organ playing, with degrees in English and now the Academy of Music from Basel, the diploma. So that's how my father came to Bangalore in 1955. He was the first Indian to teach English at Bishop Cotton Boys' School. Till then, it had been English folk and Anglo Indians, but he was the first Indian to teach English. But that also led him to a connection with St. Mark's Cathedral, at which time, during that early period, it was Edgar Holland Fuchs who was the organist at the cathedral. My father was certainly not going to displace him immediately. He used to go and they met. And in good time, my father then succeeded him as the organist of the cathedral. And he was the organist at the cathedral for 43 years till a month before he died. And that's when you became his student. He also started the St. Mark's Ecumenical School of Church Music, training all kinds of people, basically to learn the piano, and a few of you brilliant ones to learn the organ. But then the actual career he had was starting off as a school teacher, then doing two advanced degrees, one through the British Council at Mansfield College in Oxford, doing his diploma in education in the very early 60s, and then also going to the Central Institute of English and Foreign Languages in Hyderabad, where he did the diploma in teaching English. He was the only school teacher among a cohort of college lecturers, but again, he stood first in that cohort. And in 1965, the year he finished, he was offered a position at the Regional Institute of English to teach English. So he left Bishop Cotton's after 10 years and started the second phase of his career. And during this time, he also did one more thing in the early 70s now. Again, through the British Council, he was given a scholarship to go to the University of Leeds in England to do his MA in linguistics. And although many people think of him as an English professor and as an organist, his MA thesis was interestingly on the structure of the complex noun phrase in Kannada. So never gave up his identity, never gave up his language. So that's, in a nutshell, even though I've taken quite a lot of time, a journey that led him to become a professor and a musician.
My first introduction to Professor Sebastian was in 1990 when I first finished high school. My mother church, Memorial Church in Bharati Nagar, was looking for an
I
organist,
know that well.
and it was the late Reverend Flinders Stephen who had recommended me to Professor Sebastian. The first question I was asked was, do you have any prior musical knowledge? And I had to fill a form. And I said the only knowledge I had was playing the trombone in the Baldwin Boys High School brass band under the late great J.T. William Joseph. And Professor was quite fascinated by that. And I also wrote in a small corner that I had wished to learn the organ. Years passed. I continued my piano lessons, my music theory lessons, and it was in 1994. Professor came up to me and said, at one such evening, uh, did you want to learn the organ? I said, yes, very much. And he said, all right, go to the church. I will join you shortly. And then he sat me down at the organ and he taught me the first hymn.
Yes, yes,
And
of
as you know,
course.
he personally attended the panel to recommend my name to be the organist of St. Andrew's Church, and the rest is history.
It is.
Do you remember any such major musical recital or events that you could recall which Professor performed? I know he showed me an old program of the complete Bach prelude and choral recital and fugue recital he had played in 1980. But do you recall of any such events?
Yes, yes, many of them. But I just want to mention there was one more person he looked up to as an organist, and that was the great Mr. Handel Manuel, who was the organist of St. Andrew's Kirk in Madras, Chennai, for many years. My father always spoke very highly about Mr. Manuel. And I remember going with my father to a recital that he gave at Richmond Town Methodist Church and meeting him during the interval. But my father did a lot of things for the cathedral, playing every Sunday, faithfully, regularly, as I said, for almost 43 years. He was also, for some time, the choir master, selecting hymns and doing all that kind of thing, till his very good friend, Mr. Sukirtan Das, took over that role. But training the choir, that was one thing he did. Practicing every day at home on the piano and at the cathedral on the organ. The other thing that I remember him telling me that I have taken seriously in my life is whether there are two people sitting and listening to me or 2,000, I will give of my best to them. So, apart from the regular church services and training the choir, there were a number of recitals that were given periodically. And it wasn't all about him alone. He showcased people from Bangalore and even invited people from Madras. I remember singers coming from Chennai, Catholic singers. So already it was ecumenical in that sense. And it was not just organ, he constructed programs which involved the piano played by others, the organ, generally he himself, and the choir. He also did give solo recitals, carefully, meticulously crafted, and the church would be full. And since I had gone with him to the church when he practiced quite often, but mainly on Fridays when we had the choir practice, I've turned pages for him for many of the recitals. So I stood next to him, turned the pages. I know how careful he was to make sure that some of the greatest pieces written by Johann Sebastian Bach were always part of his recitals, but he didn't confine himself only to Bach. There was a range of organ music, not so much 20th century, I would say, but maybe the beginning of the 20th century. And while he had been in Switzerland, he had heard organists like Helmut Walcha, the blind organist who played the entire keyboard works of Bach and the entire organ works of Bach from memory. Walha had written chorales which my father played. Marcel Dupré, who was the teacher of my father's teacher, had also written music. So, yes, there was some 20th century organ music that he played, but the 17th century was where he was really, really proficient.
One afternoon, when we were chatting about his career as an English teacher, Professor recalled an event when he was a student on how he had an argument with his lecturer regarding a word in the English dictionary. And the story goes that the next day the lecturer came to class and said, David, I should be kicking myself. In this instance, you were right. I was a student at Christ College studying the Bachelor of Arts, and English was my subject. And Professor and myself shared a common, profound distaste for poetry in the subject of English. In his own words, he was more of an academician. We would like to know more about the English Professor Sebastian.
Sure. So, as I said, he started off as a school teacher in what at that time was the very prestigious Bishop Cotton Boys School. It was a time of transition in the mid 1950s from pre independence through independence, and now India growing as a republic. There were people from various strata of Indian society. I still remember some people in the attendance charts called the Maharaja of something or the other. But at the same time, there were poorer students who were there on scholarship. There were a lot of Anglo Indian students. There were people from the Andaman Islands, and this whole range of people that he had to deal with in a classroom for 10 years from 1955 to 65. And even today, thanks to Facebook, a number of students from that period speak extremely highly of his skills as a teacher. From that setting, when he got the position at the Regional Institute of English, he found himself dealing not with school boys, where he even trained them for the Cambridge examinations. But now he was dealing with college teachers of English in the then four southern states of Karnataka, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, and Andhra Pradesh. So people from all states came regularly to Bangalore to the Regional Institute of English to do courses in the teaching of English as a second language. And he enjoyed that kind of experience. One of the things he had to do, and he did it again with the same commitment, was He had to teach in a government school as part of his commitment to the regional institute, and he taught in the government school in Tasker Town, Hospital Road. And when you think of it, Rohit, the contrast between Bishop Cotton's and a government school near Russell Market, but he would give the best of his skills even at that level with joy. But dealing with teachers, college teachers from all these states, bringing them together, he had this sense of dry humor that made his teaching very effective. And what he did during that period was a number of programs for radio. These are days before television came to India, so these radio programs, he would go to All India Radio Bangalore near the Raj Bhavan and record. He used to write the scripts and record these, and they were broadcast all over South India as a supplement to teaching. He even wrote a book for such college teachers called English Grammar and Usage, which was not just published, I believe it was by Macmillan, but it was also the recommended textbook in all the four southern states up to a certain level of teaching. He also was asked to write abridgments of prominent English literature books. I remember the book that he did, which I really enjoyed reading the full version and then the abridged version, called The Children of the New Forest, about 1660s in England, and the kind of examples he would give. How do you use words in sentences? And he had this skill of making complex grammatical concepts understandable through a number of examples, many of which were humorous. So that's my memory of him, a very effective school teacher at first, and then a teacher of college English teachers, producing radio programs, writing textbooks. So you're right when you say that you knew him as the organist to which he gave so much time and attention and energy, but he gave a lot of time and energy and effectiveness to what was his main job in that sense, being a professor of English. And at the Regional Institute of English, he started off as a lecturer, but then became a professor. And that's how many of you know him as Professor David Sebastian. He didn't have a doctorate, even though he would have wished to do that. But within the system of that time, his two masters, one from Bombay, one from Leeds, and his Oxford diploma and his publications were deemed sufficient to promote him to the level of full professor.
A major portion of what I know about Professor Sebastian was through brief chit chats we had after the organ or piano lessons. And I still remember he had a very thick folder, and in that folder was a magazine which he had co edited.
I know that book, it's on Gavaskar.
That's right. He went on to share how he had to have arguments with Mrs. Gavaskar.
About what could go in and what couldn't.
Exactly. She wanted him to remove a certain photo of Gavaskar where he was wearing a bracelet. Apparently, the bracelet was a sign of bad luck or bad omen. But unfortunately, the magazine was well into production and had already reached the printers.
No, no, I was just recollecting the fact that the book is actually here, and I know exactly what you're talking about.
Fantastic. And I'm sure that that photo did not cause any misfortune to Gavaskar. He did well for himself then, and he still is going strong even now. And I wish that his books and records are in safe custody somewhere that it could one day be digitalized for the world to know and experience the knowledge and expertise of Professor Sebastian.
Some of those things I'm trying my best to gather as much as I can. All the books he had that he had been collecting for years, especially in linguistics, the books he bought when he was in England, the books he continued to buy, were donated to Goodwill Women's Christian College. And there's a reason for that. Goodwill, which is a college of the Karnataka Central Diocese of the Church of South India, was seeking to get a particular level of recognition, and they needed to have a large number of books in their library. And this, the donation that we made after his death, made a huge difference. But his papers and other things is something that we really need to work on going forward.
Professor Sebastian played the organ for my wedding at St. Andrews, and for a certain rehearsal, we had to pick him up from Orient Longman in Church Street, which brings us to the last part of his career where he finished off as the chief lexicographer. Could you please throw some light on that aspect of his life?
I also want to mention one thing since you mentioned his lexicographical work. As his career in the Regional Institute of English was winding down, and you know how early the retirement age was at that time, he was offered a position as senior editor at Macmillan, and he worked there for several years. There was an office in Church Road, and then there was an office, Church Street, and then one near the golf club. But then, as you pointed out, the final position he held, even at the time of his death, was the lexicographer of Orient Longman. And what he was working on at that time was a new dictionary of English where all the domains and examples would be drawn from Indian situations using Indian ways of using the Indian language, not some kind of colonial imposition on the language, but how the language had become an Indian language. So that was the project on which he was working. And as a matter of fact, there were pages and pages and pages of notes on words and their domains, which was on his table when he died, which we then handed over to Orient Longman. And when you talk about editing things, the official things he did, that would be one thing, but so many church organizations, including SCM, they wanted him to check articles and editorials, and he did all that gladly without taking any fees for that at all.
As mentioned earlier, I was in awe of this gentleman when he showed me his folder with his life's work, which very few had known about. And I only hope it's in proper hands and it is magnified in the future for everyone to see and be inspired.
And I know exactly what you're talking about. It's got a lot of photographs and all that kind of thing. And here's the one with the bracelet you're talking about.
Awesome, awesome. Professor Sebastian, in his own words, was not a showman, and if he was, he would have been as famous as Handel Manuel, traveling around the world giving organ recitals or English lectures. And I still remember he did not like an audience during his organ practices. They were his private moments. And though he was a cut above the rest, he was a unique personality. He did things his own way. Do you think that is a fair assessment of his character?
So again, it's very interesting. The biography is by Dom Morris, the famous Indian writer in English. But what lies behind it is how much work my father did on shaping the entire manuscript. Yes. So again, that's another sign of what you recognized as never being the show person, never projecting himself, doing things quietly. But in one sense, when I think of it, especially as you speak, Johann Sebastian Bach's motto and the way he lived his life was to be predominantly a church musician, and his kind of thrust was to the greater glory of God. So my father's organ and playing for weddings and funerals and regular Sunday worship was all not to focus attention on himself, but to what is beyond.
So, what would you like to see in the future as far as Professor Sebastian's legacy is concerned? And how would you like him to be remembered, especially in Bangalore?
So, one thing I would say about my father was mediocrity was not for him. And even when he thought some people were content with just doing mediocre things and the basics and all that, he would push them to excellence. So his legacy, I would say, is the desire 20 years after his death to continue to strive for excellence. That's one thing. The second thing I would say is in a fragmented society, Catholics, Protestants, Hindus, Christian, Muslims, the power of music to bring all kinds of people together. I remember in St. Mark's Cathedral and in another festival that he co started, the Basel Mission Festival of Christmas Music. It wasn't just about Western music, but also Indian music, which we also had in the cathedral. So it's not just music in a particular vein, but the power of music across the system, except, and you like this, I don't think he would ever like a keyboard and drums in the cathedral.
Oh, definitely not. And I think he swore by the organ and he felt that no other instrument deserved a place in the church other than that. And speaking about Basel Mission and some of the seeds that he has sown,
And it's still going strong.
is that over the years, schools and universities, youngsters and kids are so dedicated in an effort to produce and learn quality music,
That's right.
which in turn has helped in the overall music scenario of Bangalore. So that's how far some of his inputs have contributed.
So, on the one hand, yes, St. Mark's Cathedral as one place, but from St. Mark's, the expansion into the city and beyond, bringing people together, crossing religious and denominational boundaries, and as you said, making fine music part of the heartbeat of the cosmopolitan city of Bangalore.
Reverend Sebastian, thank you very much once again on behalf of Fine Feathers podcast for your time and dedication and helping us relive the life and times of Professor Sebastian through your words and reflections. And it was truly nostalgic. And I hope the illustriousness of Professor Sebastian continues to live through these mediums and into the future and sustain what dreams and aspirations he had for the musical life in the churches of Bangalore. And my best wishes and regards to your family as well. And thank you once again.
And thank you for furthering his legacy through this podcast. He lives on in his students and now their students. And I'm really grateful.
And we should continue the pursuit in tracing back his portfolio and other records. And from my side, I will try my best, and I'm sure you will too.
Thank you. That's something we have to take up. And also see if we can get some of his recordings he recorded a concert for Doordarshan, but we don't have that. Maybe it's in some digital file somewhere we need to retrieve.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to this episode of Fine Feathers Podcast, the music edition. And I would like to leave you with a composition by Professor David K. Sebastian, a hymn based on the Lenten text, There is a Green Hill Far Away, played on the St. Luke's Anglican Church, South Melbourne, Fincher Morgan. Good night.